Welcome to our online chat, Living Through History, COVID-19. Before we do anything else, I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and my conversation partner today, Alicia, is joining us from Boon Wurrung country. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging across both those communities, and acknowledge and uphold the continuing connection to land, waters and community. And wherever you're connecting from today, I hope you'll join me in extending your own respects too. I'm Ellie Credlin, History and Heritage Programs Officer at Glen Iris City Council, and I'm joined today by Alicia Soretto. Alicia is a professional historian with a focus on Australian community history. She is a graduate of the Master of Public History at Monash University, my old uni. Her recent work includes commissioned histories for Berry Street, The Bridge and Travellers Aid Australia. She's also president of the Professional Historians Association of Australia Victoria and a member of Oral History Victoria. In May 2020, Alicia was joined the History Council of Victoria as Deputy Executive Officer, and she's also a local resident. Welcome, Alicia.
Thanks very much, Ellie. It's great to be here and have this chat.
It is. So we'll get straight into it. I'm going to keep my intro very, very short because we've got a lot to discuss and not a lot of time to do it. So this is a discussion about local experiences and local stories. I've heard the word unprecedented getting thrown around a lot in relation to COVID-19. And of course, we know that not to be the case. We have been through something very similar before. In 1919, the Spanish flu pandemic reached Australia, and it had a profound effect locally, a profound impact on the community we now know as Glen Ira. And we're seeing a very unique local response to COVID-19 too. And so today is about looking at those two communities and how we've responded to pandemics then and now, similarities, differences, links, lessons learnt, and what we can take forward. And it's also about stories, what you can do to ensure our stories, our collective memory, our lived experience is recorded for future generations. So it's a free-ranging discussion. Alicia and I tend to go off on all sorts of tangents when we have a chat. So, but I hope you enjoyed, and I hope that it gives you something to think about. And I hope you've got your cuppa ready or your glass of wine, whatever you prefer. And we'll get right into it. There's a chat function via YouTube, so you can post your questions there. We'll endeavour to get to all of them at the end. We've set aside a good chunk of time to do that. But if we can't get to everyone, or there's a question we can't answer today, we'll take it on notice and we'll make sure we respond to that question in another forum. So I think we'll get going. Alicia, 1919, what was going on?
Yes. Well, look, there are so many similarities with the flu pandemic of very late 1918 through till 1920. But 1919, of course, is what we were mostly, dealing with that virus. There are a lot of similarities to what we're living with today. There was no vaccine at that time. It relied on quarantine, it relied on medical care, and it relied on the goodwill of the community and the action that the community could take. Now, worldwide, the flu pandemic of 1919 affected an estimated 50 million people. And of course, we're coming straight after 4 years of the First World War. So we've already got a community here that are dealing with that. Every single family really was affected, whether they served themselves, they were living back here with different limitations, or they'd lost someone, or they knew someone who had. Australia's population at that time was only about 5 million, and throughout the pandemic in 1919, about 15,000 people died. But nearly a third of the population contracted the disease. So very far-reaching, a huge impact on the community. But it's really interesting that it wasn't really very well known. So of course, now in 2020, when we're dealing with our own pandemic, it's quite natural that journalists and the community and of course historians return to the past to say, What happened back then? Are there things that we can learn from that? And one of the things that historians would note is that there's not a lot of memorialisation about this pandemic. It isn't broadly known. It's not part of our collective memory. And why is that? Maybe it's because the First World War kind of dwarfed the pandemic that was kind of the last 12 months post-war. So that could be part of why we don't know about it as much.
And on a local level, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but on a local level, what was happening in 1919?
Well, this is going to sound quite familiar. We had schools closing, we had theatres closing, we had pubs closing. Things like church services were limited or had to be outside. Public meetings were limited in terms of number. There was a debate about masks. Should we wear them? Shouldn't we wear them? And at various times in various parts of the country where we in fact had to. And of course, you know, in particular, I don't think we can underestimate that impact of the post-war recovery and how delayed it was, but also those peacetime celebrations. We couldn't gather back in 1919, so we couldn't do that sort of celebration. So they were deferred for a time. But in Glen Eira itself, I didn't mention before, but some sport was limited, and in particular to local residents would of course know the Caulfield Racecourse, and a lot of racing was suspended. Now, of course, you can imagine the letters to the editor as people got frustrated about, well, what, you know, why are we closing that off? It's outside, you know, it should be part of it. But it was closed. Yeah. So that sort of, you know, that similar human desire to have things stay the same, even though we had to deal with something quite stressful and serious. Now, of course, the First World War and its impacts were very present for the people of Glen Eira, and the Caulfield Hospital that we now know in Kooyong Road in Caulfield back then was a military hospital. So really, the community was used to the visual presence of soldiers who were coming home from war, who in many cases were in that hospital because they had quite serious illnesses. But what happened in 1919 was that hospital was co-opted as an infectious diseases hospital, and it became a great place of care for flu victims and flu sufferers.
Talking about the Caulfield Military Hospital, I think to give context to that community in particular of 1919, up to 1,000 people a day were being treated in that hospital, wounded soldiers, servicemen, servicewomen, with varying degrees of trauma to their bodies and minds. It just makes me think about that community in such a different light, the resilience of having that since 1916, that city really, of that hospital city almost, in the midst of Caulfield. And then in 1919, a pandemic hits. And that community and the resilience of that community in many ways to deal with that. It's quite astonishing.
Yeah, very much that idea of the community coping and dealing with it. There are articles talking about, you know, the volunteering that was happening. Of course, the flu hit medical professionals really hard. So, you know, we did lose nurses in particular during this time. And the council and other, you know, local government bodies, particularly in Victoria, called on volunteers to see what they could do. They said, you know, lots of people know how to look after people. Perhaps we could have some volunteer people helping out these nurses. Perhaps people could look after children for what we would call now essential workers, cooking meals. And I think, you know, we do see those, again, you talked about similarities at the beginning, but we do see 100 years apart, a very similar sort of community response in terms of when we've pitched in to help our neighbours.
There's a wonderful story about a local volunteer called Mrs. Knight, and by August 1919, she had made 600 home visits at very great risk to her own health. And in the space of, I think, 3 weeks alone, she had made 114 home visits. And so the level of yes, community support and the role of the local volunteer and that kindness was very much present in 1919. So I'm interested in this idea of I guess, technology. And looking back at 1919, do you think it was a lonelier pandemic in that people still had to retreat back into their homes, still had to self-isolate, but with none of the modern conveniences that allow us to communicate, Zoom or Facebook Messenger? And not only that, but the entertainments we have via Netflix to keep us amused when we've been locked up for days on end. So do you think it was a lonelier pandemic, or are we pushing our own kind of standards onto our ancestors?
Yeah, I think, look, in some ways that's definitely a trap for us in 2020 to say, oh, well, this is what's kept me going, or I've loved my internet shopping, or I've, what is it that has enabled me to cope in these past few months, and sort of look back to 100 years ago and say, gee, they didn't have any of that. It must have been hard, or it must have been lonely. But I think in some ways it's because it's such a big jump for us in 2020. We've gone from being able to, we can drive to the other side of town for dinner if we want to, or, we can shop from the US or shop from Europe. We can do whatever we want, it feels like. And so to have those limitations placed on us now, we feel like, whoa, we're going backwards. Yeah. Whereas I think in 1919, people lived a much more local life. And we sort of look at that local government back then called, the city of Caulfield, had much more maybe visible influence in people's lives. I think we perhaps take for granted some of the services that our local councils provide us now in 2020. But I suppose that's what part of today is, to reflect back and to look at that. But yes, we can't get in the trap of judging 1919 by our own experience too much in 2020.
Not.
Yeah.
You touched on this a little bit then, but 1919 communities were necessarily local by virtue of less mobility. Motor cars weren't in, many private families. So people were more connected to their suburb, their street, their neighbours. And today, I think during the midst of COVID, we've noticed a real resurgence of that sense of local. Should we talk about that shift for a little bit, maybe?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and something as a historian, certainly at the in those beginning weeks of moving into isolation and as things closed down, I really couldn't help looking at it from that lens of my studies and my work. And I know my fellow historians, I kept sort of talking to them about it. And I know many feel that sense of deja vu looking to 1919. But what I've seen, and in fact, I'm looking out my front window and seeing people ride by on their bikes as we speak. We couldn't exercise. In 2020, we're used to being able to go to the gym or exercise in whatever form we want to, really. But COVID-19 meant that we had to be close to home. So what did we do? We, of course, lots of people were going out for walks. Lots of people were going out for rides. I can't believe the amount of bikes that I've seen, or friends I know who've said, oh, I've suddenly now got a bike. And, running, of course. So all of that sort of low technology in some way, exercise. And maybe that's what connects us back to 1919 too, because suddenly we don't have all of this capacity. But, I think the exercise is key, because then we see our community a lot more. I remember particularly in those early days when we had that beautiful warm weather, and by 5:30 I'd see half my community walking around, and taking that opportunity as we worked out how to work from home and potentially how to help our kids learn from home too. So I've sort of loved that interaction more with our community. I've definitely seen people that I'm sure have lived here for a long time, but I've never seen them simply because we jump in our cars and go to work. We may be coming home late, so we don't interact as much with our neighbours. And I've seen that happening a lot more in my area than in the past. But what is beautiful to me is some of that really visible ways that, maybe we were, trying to enjoy or work out how to live in our apartment or house or whatever it might be. But it became part of a community connection. So in my walks around the neighbourhood, I would see beautiful teddy bears in the window, that idea of the bear hunt for those particularly younger children who understanding COVID-19 is a challenge. But having those teddy bears in the window, having rainbows in the window. And then I loved the chalk drawings on the footpath. And I think, watching them go from pictures to sort of motivational little words from kids, to things like hopscotch and people drawing little mazes on the footpath, something I've not seen very often before.
No.
And, that real sense of, well, we're enjoying our space, we're enjoying our community, but we're also trying to connect with the people around us, even if we aren't allowed to do that physically. Yeah.
And there's been a real, I guess, blurring between public and private, and that whole idea of the edge space, that we've suddenly reactivated these fences and footpaths and even our front porches or our balconies where we'd come out and interact with our neighbours. They've suddenly taken on a far more significant meaning during COVID, and it's that resurgence of the local again, I think. But it's using those spaces to maintain that social connectedness has been something that has really surprised me throughout this pandemic. And then not just the act itself, but then the sharing of it to a virtual community by social media. That's been a really surprising and heartening development.
Yeah, I think so. I think, we've captured what are those spaces that we have, again, creating those connections, so citizen placemaking, that idea of, well, we're making this broader community ours, not just within the walls of our house or our apartment, wherever we live, but the outside space. And that desire for connection, that very human desire for connection is there. And I think, there are a couple of different articles and lots of stories, particularly at the beginning, when shopping was maybe a scary place, when people were stockpiling toilet paper and all of that right at the very start. And I saw stories of people saying, hey, doing a letterbox drop and saying, I'd like to shop for you if you'd let me, to their elderly neighbours or to people who are immune compromised. So there was a lot of that breaking down barriers and, taking that community-based step that people hadn't before. In some cases, people talking about not even knowing their neighbours before at all. And then this was the impetus to get to know everyone in their building. And I think going back to your talk about community and, citizen placemaking and those spaces, your driveway, your porch, your footpath, you only need to look at what people wanted to do at Anzac Day. A lot of people were at the front with a candle at dawn, making their own way of acknowledging that day. But then also, people, particularly in Europe, where they were doing 5 p.m. every night, clap for the healthcare workers. So again, kind of making meaning out of this time. And then even just down to people having driveway catch-up drinks with their street. So,
We did that in my street.
Great. Yeah. So hearing those sorts of stories, you know, you can see people are limited from this huge array of possibilities we had at the start of 2020 down to what can we do within our own four walls or just outside. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so what do you think we're going to hold on to, or what do we want to hold on to, bearing in mind that 1919 community as well? And I guess an extension of that question is, what will historians look back on? Or is it too early to tell?
Well, it's really interesting, and I was speaking with colleagues too about, you know, what story do we tell now in the middle of it? What story do we tell next year, you know, or in 5, 10 years, or, you know, when our own kids are, you know, retired and they're telling their community what it was like to go to school and to, you know, do their karate lessons via Zoom or catch up with friends on house party. I mean, a couple of things, incredible jump in technology, both for kids themselves, for adults trying to work. You know, it became a bit of a catchphrase, the idea of pivoting your small business in the challenges that have been in front of us these past few months in particular. But I think, you know, events like this one, being an online event, it enables, you know, a great reach. It enables access for people who otherwise might not have been able to get access. So I think questions about access, and of course it's prompted questions all over the world. We only need to look at the Black Lives Matter movement and other conversations in particular that are happening in Australia, that perhaps it is something about the situation that we find ourselves in where people are saying, actually, what can we change about the world that we live in? So yes, I think there's this great desire, as much as it's important to, you know, work alongside colleagues and, you know, have your kids go to school. It's also important to connect to your local community and to value the resources that we have. I think I just saw a friend talk about a park that's really close to her house that she'd been to maybe a couple of times in the 10 years she'd lived in the area, but she's been there, you know, multiple days in a week, simply because of our limitations and realising how beautiful it is, and that it's something she doesn't want to stop doing post COVID-19.
No. So I'm interested in this idea, I guess, of public memory and public commemoration. We don't generally, yes, as you said sort of earlier on, we don't have a strong collective memory of the Spanish flu pandemic through generational lines and stories that have travelled down our family in the same way we might of ancestors who went to war, for instance. I don't know of one memorial in Australia personally to the Spanish flu or its victims. And it wasn't until I actually studied history that I even learnt about the Spanish flu, which I'm not proud of, but that's the truth. We touched on it earlier, but why do you think the collective memory of the Spanish flu is not as strong?
Yes. I mean, look, definitely that idea of when it happened, you know, we can't deny that really the First World War, coping with the First World War, and also desire to memorialise that, to celebrate the successes. There's certainly a lot of nation building that was chosen to happen after the First World War, and to use that story as something, you know, that sense of Australia, you know, coming of age during World War I. Well, probably the flu pandemic of 1919 didn't really serve that story. But we also have a really key thing. Of course, the flu affected the very young and the very old, but it also disproportionately affected those aged between 20 and 40. So it was most deadly for that age. And of course, if you think about it, they're also the people who served probably in World War One, or back then it was the Great War. So in some ways, I think it did roll into it a little bit. A lot of victims, of course, we talked about the value of care and the value of nurses in that case. And perhaps, with all of this conversation around memorials and statues, perhaps this is a time to revisit some of those events that we haven't acknowledged, and this might be one. That said, something historians look at is what stories can we tell, and how does memory endure, and how does that collective memory form your own personal memory. So because there's a big statue to this nurse from 1919, if there was such a one, which there isn't, does that make me think, oh, I value nurses? Or does that make me say, well, when I see that, I'll tell you my story of living through this pandemic? But again, what happens if it's not really told in the public arena? And there's this great story of Richard Collier, who was a historian in the 1970s in the UK, and he decided to call for stories internationally about surviving the pandemic. So if you think about that, people who were still alive in the 1970s but had lived through the pandemic and enough to remember it, that means they also lived through World War One, they lived through the Depression, and they lived through World War Two. So these are people with some pretty extraordinary lifespan and the stories that they can tell as part of it. And what Richard Collier found was that he got thousands of stories from all over the world, including from Australia, and was able to, publish as part of that. But I think it is very telling to your question too, that people didn't feel that perhaps their story was acknowledged really broadly, and maybe they were just hungry to tell that story, that it perhaps paled into insignificance in some ways to the rest of what they'd lived through. But those stories were very real. There was a lot of fear in the community. There was a lot of, different information out there as to how to survive or how to, protect yourself from it. Which again, we have those echoes in what's happened here and across the world in the last few months.
I can't believe we've nearly run out of time. I feel like we could talk for 1,000 hours about this. We might have to do part 2, Alicia.
Yes.
But we have little images that we thought we might go through and sort of share.
Yeah, fantastic.
And maybe we can use those, and then we'll get to questions very shortly. I can see a lot of them coming through, which is very exciting.
Good.
Right. So I'll share my screen. And everyone, can you see that?
Perfect.
Have I shared? Great. Hey, the technology works. Brilliant. So this is the school number 3820 on Balaclava Road, which is now Caulfield Junior College, and it was in use as an infectious diseases hospital. And this was actually run by council and funded by council in 1919. So we talked at the very beginning about the local impact, and the children of this school were actually chuffed off to the town hall in temporary classrooms. So that's a really interesting story there.
And I suppose to say that back then we didn't, we didn't have the big hospitals. There were a lot more private, really small hospitals. And one of the things, back to the Caulfield Racecourse, the casualty room there initially was felt, oh, we can use this as a hospital. It's isolated from other people. And as we know, the racing was cancelled at that time. But of course, quite quickly they realised that this wasn't going to be big enough. So that was when, the Caulfield Hospital in Kooyong Road happened. And of course, we had this multiple schools that were utilised as hospitals. But I do love the idea of the kids going and having their schooling in Caulfield Town Hall.
Yeah, and adapting.
Yeah.
So this was, do you want to tell us a little bit about this this brochure, I guess, that was released in 1919 and sort of comparisons with today?
Yeah, so I mean, of course, we see that very scary image But, you know, think about the way that we received information as, you know, people during COVID-19 in 2020, and think about social media, websites, all of that sort of really easy and immediate way that we could get information. Now, this is a professor from the US, and he put together this booklet, and as you can see, you had to buy it. And throughout the whole book, or the booklet, it gives you little pieces of advice. So if we go to the next picture, this is a suggestion to everyone that you could rip this out and paste it up in conspicuous places, or even put it in the letters that you send away. So it had all of these sorts of ideas. And if you remember right at the very beginning where we were asked to, you know, sneeze into our elbow and all of those things, that's sort of quite similar there. And this is the usage of masks. So we remember people talking about how much space we need in the workplace even now. And then the photo below is like a hairdresser or a barber. And again, you know, that's been another thing that's been part of our experience in 2020, talking about, well, how do we keep people safe? How long can appointments be, and all of that sort of thing. But yes.
The barber must guard against the breath of the man he is shaving and against the germs that lurk in the customer's hair.
Well, there you go.
Yes. So descriptive. And then, what do we have here?
Yes, so then the encouragement, again, that community sort of aspect to wear a mask, and here's how to make one if you need to wear one. And at various times there were, you know, rules around wearing masks and where you had to wear them. So,
and it certainly speaks to the fear and uncertainties of that community as well, which we've shared too. There's been a contemporary response that has been very similar. So I think we might have to get to some questions. We had a lot more to discuss. We might have to do part two.
That's okay. You might want to unshare your screen.
I want to unshare my screen.
And then we'll
answer
some questions.
I'm going to unshare my screen. Oh, stop share. Excuse me. Bit of a not so up with the tech. Right, so we're going to get to some questions. Just excuse me while I get them up here. One from Elizabeth. How did the pandemic reach Australia? Were borders shut down? Any sense of comparison then with the rest of the world? I think of Downton Abbey, which features the Spanish flu.
Well, you know, historical fiction can be good for learning a little bit about our past. But of course, it was back then as well, the unprecedented travel in servicemen and women returning home. That really is one of the biggest contributors to spreading the disease around the world. So, you know, it's very unfortunate, but, you know, at that time, you know, we weren't traveling very much. And so all of those servicemen and women coming home and, you know, picking up the disease probably in Europe and then spreading it back to Australia. And to your question around borders, absolutely. Yes, there were closed borders, sort of similar a little to what has happened here in Australia over the past few months too, where, you know, borders between states were shut or not shut, and that there was a bit of controversy or discussion around that. And we certainly had quite a few people stranded here in Victoria and not able to get home. And if you imagine up on that border between Victoria and New South Wales, when it's not very far, and the rulings didn't come across very well sometimes. So there's that similarity too.
And why it was called the Spanish flu as well, which I found really interesting. It didn't actually originate in Spain.
No.
It was just that Spain had, you know, not as stringent media censorship at the time, so it was able to report a bit more widely on it.
They did, and in fact, the King of Spain had the disease, but because Spain wasn't involved in the First World War, they could freely say that this was happening. There's a lot of talk about perhaps, you know, it had come from the US, but yes, it became the Spanish flu simply because of that. So,
This question, and I think we sort of touched on it, but maybe we can speak a little bit more to it. Do you think, this is from Rosie, do you think the focus on the local will continue beyond just coming back out of our houses and our suburbs? I've been loving getting to know my suburbs, given that I only moved here in December.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. I think there is a lot of hope for that. And I think especially at the beginning, when people are realizing, yes, I'm getting to know my suburb, I'm getting to know my neighbours, I'm getting to know my local parks or my favourite spot to ride my bike. People in some ways, we have at times glorified or celebrated that sort of the simplicity of what we're doing over the past few months. That's not for everyone, but I think a lot of people have done that. But then we have a challenge of how do we maintain that when things eventually do return to normal. But I don't think it'll be that sudden snap back to normal. So hopefully the slower return to the normal can allow us to celebrate a quieter, slower pace, perhaps.
Maybe.
More local.
Hope.
Yeah.
We've got a question from Janet. Could a reference be provided to the Richard Collier book that Alicia has just referred to? Yeah, what we'll do is we'll pop that in the chat later, and also we can even direct message you that, Janet, or we can pop it when we get this up on our Facebook feed in next week. We can pop a reference to it in there. I'm not sure it was a book. I think it was a study, but we'll certainly provide you with that link. That's not a problem. This is a question from Barb. I heard there were flu epidemics in Australia in 1957 and I think 1968. Do you know about these epidemics? And perhaps we should be collecting people's memories of these now. I was not aware of that. I'm not an expert on epidemics, though.
That's right. And, there are colleagues of mine who are looking at this and, in fact, are studying it right now. So it's been quite extraordinary for them to be looking at, pandemics, particularly the 1919 flu, at the same time as living through it. But yes, certainly there have been past pandemics, and I like the idea of, embracing those stories and encourage anyone who does know people who've lived through that and would like to tell their story to think about it and be fascinating to hear what they have to say living through 2022.
There's one more thing I would like to really, really discuss, and then we're going to move on to showing people about ways that they can contribute to the collective memory. But there's just one little, another sort of thought bubble that's just popped into my head. I read somewhere, I think it was in the Atlantic, and a journalist and a commentator said that if history repeats itself, it's only because human nature stays relatively constant. And reading through newspaper articles and diaries written during the pandemic, this writer noticed an eerie flash of recognition: the dark jokes, the gossip, the conspiracy theories, the breathless speculation reminded the writer of scrolling through Twitter and people sort of wrestling with life by memeing their way through a crisis. I'm interested in the idea of social media being the new journal or the new letter to the editor, or I'm just interested in social media and what are the equivalents, I guess.
Yes.
That makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And, future historians are, social media has been fascinating in terms of how people have processed it. So in terms of, even just looking at that with the idea of turning local, my local Facebook group for people living in my area, where people were sharing information, talking about where are the street libraries in our area, talking about, what are the businesses doing? How can I do my duty and support local business? And so I wouldn't be surprised to look at the pattern of local Facebook groups and wondering if we had a great uptick in membership of those groups. And in terms of that sort of venting, I think, you do see that idea of Twitter as the place to grumble, sometimes Facebook, sometimes people are sharing sort of outlandish suggestions. And I wanted to show you a couple of examples. And one is really that we have you know, a different view of newspapers now, I think. Whereas, and many of you would know Trove, which is the website I've popped up for you. And of course, Trove comes to us from the National Library, and it has an incredible amount of local papers. Now, this one's, of course, the Sydney Morning Herald, but it gives you a good example to the editor of the Herald. The present mask regulations are grotesque and useless. And then, you know, goes on sort of talking about how germs act and all of this sort of thing. But I think it gives you that example of how people grumbled in a public way back in 1919 versus the way that we do it now, probably via Twitter and other social media forms.
So this guy would have jumped on Twitter.
This guy, I reckon in 2020, this would have been a real, maybe a lengthy post on Facebook or a 240 character whinge on Twitter. And then across to this one, I really love this one here. It's Nurse Curtin's Good Advice. Now, this is a newspaper, and this goes to show what newspapers were like in 1919. This is the Zeehan and Dundas Herald, which is a small town in the west of Tasmania. And this is a letter that came from a nurse who worked at the Caulfield Hospital and had some advice for nurses in Tasmania who might be having to deal now with the flu pandemic. So she's giving her advice in this article. It's been printed in the paper. And again, you know, if we think about this, how would it be shared now? Would this be a really formal, you know, advice that would go from hospitals that have dealt with it? And I think that's our advantage in 2020, that we have, you know, such an incredible communication in terms of dealing with the disease on a medical from the medical framework, you know, or would it be from friends who work at different hospitals, you know, in a WhatsApp group, you know, how would this be shared?
Maybe a Zoom conference.
Maybe, it probably would be. And in this day and age, you're right, it would be a Zoom webinar or something.
A webinar, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we're nearly out of time, and that makes me really sad, but we will have to wrap up soon. But I think what I'm sort of getting from this entire conversation is that our contemporary response has actually been quite similar to 1919. And we've self-isolated, we've supported each other, but there have been fears, there have been uncertainties because of the disruption to our lives and the fear of illness. And we've expressed these fears and uncertainties through the channels that we have available to us. The shape and makeup of our neighbourhoods have changed. The tools that we use to communicate have evolved. But I think what I'm sort of realising is that in times of crisis, human nature is pretty constant. And we see connection. And it's been heartening to see as we look at the two pandemics together and see that connection. And also that this event will live on in our memories because we're living through it, in our personal memories and in our personal histories. And it's impacted all our lives to such a great extent. And to translate that to collective memory, I think we all have a part to play in that. And that's where we come to your stories. So we're interested very much in the local experience of the pandemic. So I'm going to, are you still sharing, Alicia? No, I'm going to share. And everyone see that? Can you see that? So we've got a little, via the Glenara Community Hub, we've got a little project called Your Stories, the COVID-19 Collecting Project, and we're really interested in local stories. So this is Gail, who in 1960, this little man, Teddy, came into her life, and 60 years later, he sat in her window and gave joy to passers-by. So Gail's lived in Caulfield, in the city of Glenara for most of her life. So it's these kind of stories that we're really interested in collecting. So you can go onto the Your Stories collecting page, and we can post the link. later on. So the Glenara Community Hub's really great. There's fun things to do. It will connect you to local businesses, people who are businesses that are trading. And then we've got the Your Stories part here.
You'll need to,
and you can upload.
Ellie, you'll need to unshare your the teddy bear picture and then swap over to share to the website.
Thank you, Alicia. Clearly,
That's
I'm not very good at this, am I?
No.
Oh, we were going so well too.
You're doing great.
Oh, share screen. Oh, no, there it is. Okay. Slight hitch. Thank you, Alicia.
That's all
So
good.
we have here, you're going, we right? Yep.
All good.
So you can upload your stories here. So whether it be a picture, an audio file, your Zoom conference with your family, whatever it is, we would love to see it. And we would love to upload it into a little archive that we're keeping to really capture that local collective memory, because we know how important it is. So we'll post a link on the Facebook when this goes live, when we upload this later on, and you can access it via that. I think that's all we have time for. Thanks, Alicia, and to everyone involved today in bringing this event to you. As I said, this In Conversation can be viewed next week on the Arts and Culture Facebook page. Feedback is always welcome. A survey will be sent to you probably tomorrow, but you can always email any feedback through to arts@glenara.vic.gov.au. The next event, next Sunday, is 28th of June at 3 p.m. We have Tamara Coulden and Miss C in the Big Balloon Stunt Show. Glenara musician Tamara performs songs from the Great American Songbook, French chanson classics and vintage jazz, blues and European gems, joined by James Sherlock on guitar and Ben Hanlon on double bass. How good does that sound? And then for the little ones, roll up and zoom in, no pun intended, to see the craziest stunts you never thought were possible with Miss C in the Big Balloon Stunt Show. So please register for that. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.